what has come out over the last week or two has been this idea of changing the taxes on properties.
I hate this shit. I think it's awful. People talk about being asset rich, cash poor, but if you're sitting on a £2 million house, congratulations, you are rich.
Hello and welcome to The Rest is Money with me, Steph McGovern, and podcast friend Dan Neidle, who, as you know, is a leading tax lawyer and investigative journalist. So, Dan, we've got you back to talk about some of these tax ideas that are being thrown around at the moment. I mean, it's dead interesting, this, isn't it? It's like, put them out over the summer, leak all these ideas and see how people react to it.
I hate this shit. I think it's awful, and I wish they wouldn't do it, because we end up with an atmosphere of slight financial fear and confusion, which I think is bad for the UK.
Yeah, it's that uncertainty again, isn't it? So, we know Rachel Reeves has got this big black hole in the finances. We know already about cuts to spending that are happening. So everyone is talking about the only answer being here, if she wants to fill that black hole and stick to these fiscal rules, is for her to increase taxes. But on top of this, she has this election manifesto, which says they'll not put up taxes for working people. So no rise in income tax, national insurance and VAT. Now, obviously, we've talked a lot on this podcast about how by proxy you are kind of putting up taxes for working people. But what has come out over the last week or two has been this idea of changing the taxes on properties. So first of all, what's your initial reaction to these kind of tax ideas that are being put out? And then we'll go through the specifics of each one.
Name an area of tax. I don't know. Oil, gas, beards. Somewhere in Whitehall, there is a filing cabinet burgeoning with proposals for changing tax on that. And so a minister says, let's look at tax on property. Ta-da! A civil servant triumphantly pulls out something they prepared years ago. And property tax, there'll be more than almost any other area of tax. I'll contradict myself. Probably, almost certainly more than any other area of tax. All of these old proposals can now land on ministers' desks. Some of them will be realistic. Some of them will be useless. But there will be a lot of proposals. It looks like we are getting snippets of a bunch of different proposals, many of which are being confused and rolled together.
Yeah, because they are confusing. I mean, one of the big ones that everyone's talking about, because everyone's thinking about how it affects them personally, anecdotally, this is the one all my family are chatting about, is this property tax on homes which are worth over $500,000. So kind of replacing stamp duty with a new annual property levy. Talk me through this. Do you think this is a good idea? Will it make them much money?
Probably I need to do a boring thing and confess a conflict of interest. So
right.
Yeah, at my age, given my background, people will be unsurprised to hear that I own property. I'm probably not going to move again. So I'm not going to benefit from an abolition of stamp duty, and I'll be hit by an ongoing property tax.
Okay, so the conflict's out there.
Conflict's out there, but stamp duty is a really terrible tax. It's a terrible tax because when you tax something, you get less of it. Stamp duty is a tax on moving house. So, surprise, surprise, it stops people moving house. And that's kind of predictable. The really surprising thing is quite how big the effect is. The OBR looked at what happened when stamp duty rates changed in 2014. They saw a massive effect. Every 1% increase in stamp duty knocks about 7% off the number of transactions. So stamp duty altogether probably deters about 70,000 house sales a year. That's a massive effect. And that has a whole bunch of impacts. First of all, it makes people miserable. You want to move home, you can't because of stamp duty. It damages the job market because people can't move to find jobs. It reduces house building because that reduction in volume of purchases means that house sales are slower, meaning that house building is more difficult. It takes you longer to get your money back. So stamp duty is a deeply damaging tax, and I don't think there's an economist in the country who thinks it's a good idea. The same thing to do is to abolish it and replace it with an ongoing property tax. Doesn't mean it's popular, but it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and you've said this before on the podcast about stamp duty not working, and as you say, there's a lot of people out there who agree. So this property tax then, isn't there a danger that might stop people doing up their houses, because then it'll add value to them and then might push them over that 500 grand threshold, or, it might stop them moving house completely. So even though you're taking away, as you say, the stamp duty for buyers, sellers might then just be put off, and that could slow down the market. But do you think this will be less? Is that why you think this will be better?
The detailed implementation is both difficult and very important. So one key point, it should be a tax on land value, not a tax on property. If I buy an empty plot and I spend a lot of money doing it up, it is a bad thing if I then get taxed for the improvement that I've created, because that's disincentivizing me from improving. It'll be much better to tax me on the empty plot, giving me an incentive to do it up. And then once I've done it up, my effective rate of tax compared to the value I've created falls. So land value taxes give you an incentive to develop property. A tax that's just on the value of the property gives you an incentive not to develop property, not to improve your property. So that's important. And another feature is, this is unlikely to be popular in many quarters. I think for people looking to get on the housing ladder, the disappearance of stamp duty should be a good thing. And the fact that it improves the market generally should be a good thing. But that's a slightly ephemeral theoretical benefit, and there are unlikely to be demonstrations in support of the tax. On the other hand, someone who's living in a £600,000 house probably doesn't want to be paying a tax every year that they weren't paying before. So they will probably be rather unhappy. And that's the political problem. Whenever you have a tax change, even a very sensible one like this, supported all across the political spectrum, from right to left, there will be losers and they'll be unhappy. The danger comes if government does things to compromise with those people and make them happier, and that causes damage. So an obvious thing to do would be to say, okay, this is very hard. We're not going to apply this tax to people currently in houses. We're only going to do it to people who move house. The problem there is then a lot of people just won't move house. They'll say, I'm in this fantastic, very expensive house and I'm not paying this new tax. But if I move, I will. So I'm not going to move. So you've ended up achieving something similar to stamp duty, maybe worse. You've disincentivized moving. You've slowed down the housing market. So compromises with the electorate like that, tempting for politicians, but potentially undo the benefit of what you're trying to achieve.
There's also in this the regional argument, isn't there? The fact that there's obviously such a big difference between house prices, in the north, for example, versus, say, London. So, this would particularly hit London hard. But I don't know if that's a bad thing, because that then might encourage people to move further afield outside of the south, and maybe that's good for regional inequality.
But it's absolutely right that if we're talking on properties above, say, £500,000, in London, you could just fall over such properties down the average street. The further you get from London, particularly if you're going in a northerly direction, the less common such houses are. So it could well be perceived as a tax on London. In many respects, it would be. This wealth is real. People may not feel like it. People talk about being asset rich, cash poor. But if you're sitting on a £2 million house, congratulations, you are rich.
And then the other side of this, just on the stamp duty point, is there's obviously a threshold before you start paying stamp duty. And for first time buyers, it's like, what is it, £300,000?
Yeah.
And, if you're not a first time buyer and it's your main home that you're buying, it's 125,000, isn't it? So I know the average property is a lot more than 125 grand these days. But again, coming back to that regional point, it's not as big of a deal in the poorer areas as it is in the rich areas.
That's right. But the average price of a detached house in the UK as a whole is £440,000. And there is pretty chunky stamp duty on that. I think if you're not a first-time buyer, that's £12,000. £12,000 for most people is a large amount of money, and makes buying that house more difficult than it otherwise would be. And there's one housing market. We don't have a market for first-time buyers and a market for other buyers. And if you make it harder for someone to buy £1 million house, then you're making it harder to construct a chain with £1 million house at one end and £200,000 flat at the other. So anything that deters transactions is a bad thing. That's not to say we shouldn't tax people in £1 million houses. I think we should, but transaction taxes are a bad thing.
So obviously the deal with this is trying to fill this black hole. That's the reason why these ideas are being put out there. Have you got any idea on what difference this would make, this property levy on homes over $500,000? Like, is there any estimates out there on how much it might bring in compared to the stamp duty system?
So the most detailed proposal out there was put together by a rather brilliant economist called Tim Lernick for Onward, which is a centre-right think tank. And it wasn't a land value tax. It was what he called a proportional property tax. And it was really clever. What he said we'd do is we replace council tax with an annual levy on properties below £500,000, which would be about 0.44%, and then replace stamp duty with a national levy of 0.54% or a bit more on property values above £500,000. But that wasn't raising any tax. That was just replacing stamp duty and council tax. Now, of course, you could tweak those numbers and raise more tax, but I suspect politically that gets a bit hard. I can imagine, maybe I'm naive, but I can imagine a political cell that goes, here, we are reforming property tax. This is a good thing. It's better for growth. It's better for first-time buyers. It's better for anyone looking to move house. Some people will pay more tax. Some people will pay less. But we promise to you there is no extra tax raised from this. That seems to me a defensible line to take. Once you start raising tax from it, I suspect it will become a good deal less popular. How much could you raise? I mean, we're probably talking single-figure billions in terms of how much you could realistically raise from a measure like this. Something else people discuss is putting additional bans on council tax. So at the moment in England, council tax bans run from A to H. And if you are in H, you pay twice as much as if you're in an average band D. That's kind of weird because it means that someone in a £100 million mansion pays only twice as much as someone in an average house. So a lot of these things to do is say, okay, let's make H1, H2, H3, let's make different bands. If you do that, it's a lot simpler than a dramatic new property tax, but you're only raising hundreds of millions rather than billions. Can I plug Tax Policy Associates' website? I'm hoping we'll have a calculator up soon showing how much you can raise from all these different proposals.
Oh, that's great. I know, because we've talked about that so often, haven't we, Dan, between ourselves and also with various other people we've had on, about how ridiculous it is that we've still got this council tax system based on valuations from 1991. It just feels like that is an easy win. Surely you can present that as we're just updating things, everyone. You know, things have changed so much since 1991. And, I saw some estimates from Savills, the estate agents. This was in a great article in the Financial Times about the combined value of the UK housing market hit £9 trillion for the first time last year, compared to just £3.4 trillion a decade earlier. So that is a staggering increase in value in houses. So it does feel like that is where the tax changes could come legitimately. Updating
the valuation is absolutely the rational thing to do. It is nuts that we have 34-year-old figures in our council tax band. At the top of band H is £320,000, which buys you pretty much nothing anywhere in the country these days. Now, I think on average values have risen about 5 times. If we updated those values, then some people will pay more, some people will pay less. And again, that's something which for politicians is a scary thing. Yes, the tax nerds think it's a good idea and it would make the system clearer and more transparent, but it's not really a political win. On the other hand, there will be angry people. And let's not forget, council tax was born after the catastrophe of the poll tax, which probably brought down the Thatcher government. And because of that, council tax is seen as a terrifying tax by politicians, which you touch at your peril.
Dan, sit tight. Loads more to ask you about, but we're going to go to a quick break. So let's have a look at some of the other things being talked about. And as you say, there's a bit of a crossover between these. It's hard to unpick them as individual things, but capital gains tax, you currently don't pay on your main house when you sell it. What do you think the impact could be of changing that?
So every so often, I'm going to be really diplomatic. Someone comes across a true statistic. The cost of the capital gains tax exemption on homes is £31 billion. They go, wow, we could raise £31 billion by abolishing this exemption. No, you couldn't. And the reason why you couldn't is, imagine you are in an average house, £440,000. So if you bought that some years ago, you might have bought it for £250,000. So you are currently sitting on a gain of, let me do the maths, £190,000. That's fantastic. And that is the average gain you'd see on an average house over the last 15 years. Today, if you move house, you're going to pay stamp duty if you move into an equivalent house, about £12,000, which is a lot. But if you are taxed on your capital gain, which just reflects house price movement, nothing else, you would have additional tax of £45,000. I'm going to guess there is basically no one in an average house who could afford a £45,000 additional tax bill. So no one's going to move house. If you impose tax on that basis, you'd have what's called lock-in. It's been seen in some other countries. People wouldn't move house when the house is sitting at a gain. We can say from OBR figures, housing market transactions, purchases would fall by at least half. So you can't do that. It would be a catastrophe. And no country does that. There are countries which kind of charge capital gains on people's homes, but then they always have very generous exemptions, which mean that pretty much no one pays it. The most common way they do this is deferral. You say, okay, you've got this gain, you're moving house, we're going to defer that gain, and you won't pay tax when you sell now, you'll pay tax when you sell your last house, or when you downsize. And in almost all countries, if you die, there's never any tax. So deferral kind of means the tax is never paid, or even worse, it means the tax is never paid and people never sell, and you end up with underoccupied houses. So deferral is, you don't raise much tax and it's not great. The other thing, in America, they have a big exemption for people. So no country in the world really taxes capital gains on people's homes, and it's not realistic to think that we can.
Yeah, because as you say, it'll change behaviour and stop people selling their homes. You mentioned there a couple of examples from other countries then. Is there anywhere you think where they're getting this right on how they tax properties and land and everything else? Is there anyone we can learn from, do you think?
I think quite a lot of countries don't have a big transaction tax when you buy, but have an annual tax. So that famous Socialist Republic of America, many US states, including, again, radical socialist states like Florida, have an annual property tax of kind of around 1%. And they do it. Why can't we?
Yeah, and why can't we? Just because it's such a big shift from what we've had, that politicians feel too scared because they think that will then be the death of them.
Exactly. A lot of the stuff we write on the Tax Policy Associates website, people say, well, why don't politicians know this? Why don't they do this? And the politicians all know this. Almost nothing we write is unusual or innovative or new. But the question for the politicians isn't how can we do this? It's how can we be re-elected afterwards? And that's a very difficult question.
Yeah, which is never what's good for the country. You know, we all know this, don't we? That short-termism means decisions aren't taken for the long term, which would be better for the economy and for the country.
Exactly. And we end up locked into council tax, which was created in an accident, in a panic after the poll tax failed. And we're still there 35 years later.
So let's talk mansion tax then. Like, how different is that from like the capital gains tax idea, and you know what impact do you think that would have, and how would it work?
Yeah, so I think there's a variety of changes which are saying, hey, don't worry, average household, we're only going to tax really wealthy households. And that would placate some Labour MPs who think a wealth tax is a good idea. It isn't, but this could be sold as some kind of wealth tax, and it would raise a bit of money. So what could you do? One thing you could do is you could say, we'll just have capital gains tax on sales of valuable houses. The Times reported they were thinking of doing this for houses of 1.5 million. That would be a really bad idea. The reason it's a really bad idea is that capital gains tax is going to deter people from selling. And if you deter people from selling, I mean, yeah, that's a bad thing of itself, and it will have complicated economic consequences for the rest of the market. But just in narrow tax terms, if people aren't selling, it means you're not collecting the stamp duty the government currently collects. And we've calculated that it's pretty likely that the stamp duty you lose is similar to or even more than the capital gains tax you make. So putting capital gains tax on high value properties would either not raise much or even lose money.
Right. So again, not worth it.
Yeah. Well, what about a sort of Miliband-style mansion tax? So in 2015, in the Labour Party's manifesto, they proposed, it was something like 1% on homes worth £2 million.
Yes.
I think Labour copied it from the Lib Dems. It was massively popular if you poll people. And there's kind of a rule in tax. If you put out an opinion poll which says, hey, would you like to should we raise tax on people who are not you? People go, yeah, taxing other people seems a really good idea. And if you present it without context, without arguments the other way, then you normally end up with very high support. On the back of that, Labour put the mansion tax in their manifesto. But during the election campaign, it began to be viewed a bit less favourably. People start thinking, well, okay, this isn't me now, maybe it is me in the future. Maybe they're going to extend this tax over time to tax me. And probably for that reason, Labour abandoned the policy soon after, and Jeremy Corbyn, who you'd think would be in favour of such things, didn't reinstate it in either of his elections. So would they do something like that now? Don't know.
And you mentioned wealth tax because, of course, we recently had the Labour grandee, former party leader Neil Kinnock talking about a wealth tax where he was saying a 2% annual levy on assets exceeding £10 million. And he reckons this could generate between 10 and 11 billion pounds for the Treasury every year. What do you think?
The wealth tax is the absolute peak of let's tax other people. But if you look at how such a tax would actually work, what you're doing is you're taxing savings and investments. And again, if you tax something, you get less of it. What's the consequence of taxing savings and investment? Well, you get less growth. And people have modelled that and seen that taxes very similar to this would hit GDP by somewhere between 2% and 5%, which is huge, would cost hundreds of thousands of jobs, would hit foreign direct investment. These are very serious consequences. So the wealth tax, I think the business secretary described it as daft. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
And if the business secretary says it's daft, we can probably be reasonably confident the government isn't going to do it.
Yeah. Yes. Well, yeah, if they're saying it's daft, they're definitely not, are they? So we've talked about council tax, the fact that needs to change, but what do you think what is Rachel Reeves going to do you think? I know you're not Mystic Meg or you haven't got a crystal ball or whatever to tell us, but as you've said, there's problems with all of them in terms of how they're taken by the electorate, the impact it might have on the next general election, which is obviously still a couple of years away, but if the pain's felt now, that might be enough to boot them out next time. So what do you think is going to happen? We know, obviously, this week we got the borrowing figures as well, and it was slightly lower than expected in July, but still we're in a massive state when it comes to our debt and deficit. What do you think we're going to see in autumn?
Straight up, my history of political predictions is shit. I'm really bad at this. I said before the last budget that, no, ignore those rumours about increasing employers' national insurance. No one will be that stupid. It's the worst possible tax raise, and they did it. So probably any rational listener should turn off at this point and listen to someone else. But I'll have a go anyway, because it seems unsporting not to try. So if some of the top end figures are true and there really is a black hole with 50 billion, then doesn't matter what they said in the manifesto. The only way to raise those sort of sums is income tax, national insurance, VAT. There's no other way to do it. If the figure they need is much less, say around 10 billion, you can get there by freezing thresholds for another year. Then you're looking at stuff on the margins. So introduce a couple more council tax bans, say you can raise several hundred million from doing that. This or that changed to other taxes, mainly affecting people with lots of money. You could raise a few billion. But you can scrimp and save, and you can add an additional tax here, an additional tax there. I think there's a point at which successive budgets making additional tax changes becomes damaging. If you did this in one go, you say, right, we are going to tax the wealthy like this, that's it, done, bam, billions of pounds, we're not doing it again, then that's one thing. But if each year there's salami-style slicing, gradually more and more being taken. It sends out a message which is a little bit damaging. So I wish they wouldn't do that. I wish they'd do a one-off tax reform, new taxes, one and done.
Rachel Reeves said, like, when we interviewed her last autumn, you know, when these £40 billion worth of tax increases came in, and, you know, you mentioned that one on national insurance contributions paid by employers, and that is partly the reason why they brought more tax revenues in July. But she said then to us when we were interviewing her that this would be like the one big tax rise, and, you know, yeah, businesses are going to take the majority of the hit, but then after that, it's not, you know, we're going to get growth and everything's going to be all right. So it feels that she tried that, but it didn't work. I mean, I'm sure
she meant it.
Yeah. And then when we talked to her in spring, after the spring statement, it was very much like global uncertainty, geopolitics, Trump coming in, blah, blah, blah. To blame?
Yeah, I wouldn't want her job. Wouldn't do it in a million years. Can I be depressing for a second? I worry about tax in the UK. So I worry that we're in a position where we have a population that's getting older, which means year after year we need more spending on the NHS, more spending on pensions, more spending on social care. So that's an escalator going up and up and up. We protect those areas, which means that there's spending cuts, really dramatic ones, in other departments. So we've got a choice. We can do kind of three things. We can dramatically cut pensions and benefits for older people. Probably not going to happen. We can dramatically cut other services, which is really what's been happening for the last 15 years. Or we can put up taxes. And really, that has to mean for everyone. I don't think there's another way. And if we continue just kind of staggering on, not making one of those choices, then we end up with the cuts anyway, and we end up with tax rises anyway, and everyone's unhappy because we think we're paying more tax, and we are, and we think services are getting worse, and they are. But the only way out of this is to either accept cuts in services or increase tax. I don't think there's anything else. And people on the left who say, oh, yes, we can magically raise billions of pounds from people who are not you. Outside of small change, it's just not true. People on the right who say, oh, yes, we can raise billions of pounds by cuts that we're not going to specify now or by efficiency savings, are also not true. So until we have politicians on the left who are ready to argue for tax rises, or on the right who are ready to argue for spending cuts, we're going to continue to sleepwalk to general unhappiness, which makes me depressed.
Yeah, it's making me depressed as well. Hey, so here's another idea for you. This one is from producer Ross, who works on the show. Is there a way around VAT? Could you raise more money from VAT where instead of putting VAT up, you bring VAT down a bit, but apply it to absolutely everything rather than have the exemptions you have? So could that be a way around their manifesto about we're not going to put taxes up on working people, but a way of bringing in more money because you can put it on things that currently are exempt?
Has Ross been listening to the radio show? Can I plug something else? Untaxing, available now on BBC Sounds. It's a short series that we did. One of them is about Jaffa cakes and about the ridiculous VAT phenomena. Yes, yeah. Is Jaffa cake a biscuit or a cake? On one level, it's funny. On the other, it's just stupid. But the deeper thing is, why do we have 0% VAT, say, for children's clothes? And we don't want people on low income to be prejudiced by VAT on children's clothes. But the exemption doesn't just apply to everyone on low income. If you go to the Harrods website, you will see children's gold jackets for £8,000, 0% VAT, courtesy of this rule. What we could do is we could say, okay, from now on, VAT on children's clothes is going to be 20%. We're going to increase child benefit so the average family doesn't lose out, and raise some tax. And you could do something similar across all of these VAT 0% special rates exemptions. You could put measures in place so the poor don't lose out, and then you could raise revenue and or cut the headline rate. So you could do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ross just made a better suggestion than I did in the rest of this podcast. So you could do it. Is a government ready to tax children's clothes?
But the way you've pitched it,
I would hope you could if you're explaining that child benefit is going up. But
would those costs, would that would that bring enough in then? If it was on children's clothes, would that bring enough in so that it would cover the cost of the rise in child benefit, but also bring more in to justify it?
Children's clothes, you'd bring some in by doing that, for about a billion or something like that. If you do that with all the 0%, then you could raise useful single figure billions. If you're protecting people, which realistically you have to, you're not going to raise vast sums by doing that. But we go into this in more detail on the show available now on BBC Sounds, Untaxing Jaffa Cakes. You can Google it.
Is that what it's called? Untaxing Jaffa Cakes?
So the show is called Untaxing. There's 5 episodes. One of them is about Jaffa Cakes. Yeah.
Tell us about the website that you were talking about, where you can look up the impact of the tax changes as well, because I imagine there's quite a few of our listeners who'd want to have a go at looking at that too.
So Tax Policy Associates website will soon, as soon as we can put it together, have a page where you can play around with council tax rates. There is an existing detailed article about the wealth tax and why it's a bad idea. And there's an article about capital gains tax on homes and why that's not workable, with the maths showing why it could well lose money. So yes, apply for the Tax Policy Associates website.
Excellent, which is obviously where you spend most of your time dealing with all that. So, Dan, lovely to chat to you as ever. This is never the end between you and this podcast and everything else, because there's so much going on. We're always desperate to get your expertise on it. So thank you very much, Dan.
Delighted to impress your listeners further.
Right, that's it from us then. Bye-bye.
Bye.